Good morning, folks. Thanks for watching this Tuesday morning weather update. I want to start here. This is the lightning map that's valid here as this morning. It's about 6 a.m. Central Time. And I turned this on because I heard some thunder outside my house here in Central Illinois. And I always kind of pull this up. If picnic, baseball game, you want to hear where the thunder is coming from, see how many lightning strikes are nearby. You just go to blitzertung.org. I believe that's the German word for lightning. And you can pull up this live map here. Now, it's relevant locally, but if you look nationally, there's, I think, a pattern here just this morning and where the thunderstorm activity is, stretching anywhere here from well up into Ontario, Canada, back through the Midwest, down all the way through Texas, even into Mexico here this morning. If you ask me, Matt, where is the front, right, organizing these thunderstorms located, I'd probably just draw that line just behind those thunderstorms here. And if we actually jump over and look at the wind and the temperature this morning, boy, it lines up nicely, right, with where we're seeing those severe thunderstorms. And this focus for activity or for these storms is relevant both to what happened yesterday. We'll take a look at those severe reports in a second, and then where this forecast is going as this front is now moving northwest to southeast. So where we see this activity now this morning, you kind of just imagine this slowly moving toward the southeast here today. And that's going to be an area of focus for severe thunderstorm development, anywhere from New York, upstate New York, even here all the way back through Texas. We'll talk about that all in just a second here. Now, I did mention yesterday the severe reports on April 28th. We had a moderate risk out for western Wisconsin, portions of Minnesota, and Iowa as well. So a number of hail reports to move through, tornado reports in here as well, just a few of those, so quite a few tornado and severe thunderstorm warnings, even some large hail over here near east of Sioux Falls. And this activity stretched through Kansas and Oklahoma, Texas as well. And it's going to be pushing east here today, hopefully with less severe reports as always. But if we just look at the last 24 hours, maybe last 16 to 18 hours of radar presentation here, you can see that activity slowly making its way east through time here into the overnight hours. And then just the last few frames are catching it up to where we're at currently. In fact, I'll pause it right here this morning. So see that thunderstorm activity here. The radar is not quite reaching from the U.S. over into Canada here, so these would look quite a bit stronger if we had a closer radar. The thunder over central Illinois, now getting into central Indiana here this morning, and more activity over Oklahoma stretching through Texas as well. Now, I talked last week about some of the historical rainfall swaths. What I mean by that is we're just looking at the last 24 hours of precipitation. Now, we talked about the severe thunderstorms that moved through Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, just west of Kansas City, through Texas. And if you look closely at these, at least let's start here in the upper plains, northern plains, the upper Midwest, you can sort of tell, like I mentioned last week, that there's flow in the atmosphere, there's momentum, because where those storms were raining, they were quickly being ushered off to the east. You can almost see the background flow of the jet stream over top of the system, moving the rainfall through quickly in these kind of broad paintbrush strokes. Now, to the south, last week, we saw this kind of splotchy, summer-like presentation where there wasn't even a clear kind of momentum or movement to some of these storms. That's not necessarily the case here over the last 24 hours, or at least even through the rest of this week, I think, because we have this trough that's centered over the western U.S. We'll take a look at that in just the next slide here. But that's imparting enough flow over the top to kind of organize these storms and move them, at least in some direction, right off into the east here in North America. So it's at least good news for precipitation this week. We've talked about a lack of momentum that's kind of built into the atmosphere. We'll talk about that in just a few slides here. But I keep an eye on these things. Just the fact that that front is moving through the U.S. indicates there's at least some flow, right? This pattern is trying to work itself forward, which is what we like, right? When we're trying to avoid long stretches of dry weather, or even kind of the opposite, long stretches of wet weather without these systems moving through here. So the reason for that, again, is this trough. If we jump over and look at the upper level jet stream here this morning at 500 millibars, there's that weak trough centered across the western U.S. There's that flow, right, making those more broader paintbrush strokes across this area rather than that kind of splotchy summertime popcorn convection, if you will, that just kind of lights this up like a Christmas tree. And that's going to be the influence for our weather over the next kind of 1, 2, 3, and then the 4-day forecast here for the rest of this work week. We'll have to see where we're going the week after that, because kind of broadly, if you look at this flow here, it's still lacking generally a bit of momentum. And what I mean by that is the Pacific jet stream is well up here near Alaska. It's kind of flowing through Canada here. And if it wasn't for this trough that's come down here, right, we'd still be talking about a pretty significant lack of momentum through the central U.S. So this trough has bought us a little bit of time. It's certainly bought us quite a bit of precip and some severe reports as well, unfortunately. But we'll have to see where this pattern goes, because generally this background state still looks a bit uneasy for me. in terms of that lack of momentum. Now that trough that is positioned here is going to be working its way over the next 48 and 72 hours across the central U.S. and then into the eastern U.S. So I want to talk about that in a second in terms of the severe weather and that thunderstorm potential. I'm going to make this valid as about 6 a.m. this morning. This is the 3-kilometer NAM forecast. And quickly here you can see what was prompting those lightning strikes that we saw in Blitzertung up into Canada. You can see into central Illinois, getting into central Indiana here. So this forecast lining up nicely. And then Oklahoma, and then some spotty showers and storms over Oklahoma as well this morning. So take this forecast forward into lunchtime. We'll take it out to 1 p.m. Central. See the storms kind of reorganizing here on that front, almost right across the Ohio River Valley, and expecting additional activity here in upstate New York. We just talked about that. We actually have an enhanced risk from the Severe Storm Prediction Center, I should say. Again, stretching activity. You can find thunderstorms along the front and out ahead of it through Ohio, portions of Indiana, Kentucky, Missouri, down into southern Illinois, and then stretching all the way back to Oklahoma, and then even the panhandle of Texas. Take the forecast, make it valid as a 7 p.m. See some stronger storms now over West Texas, following now into the Tennessee Valley, Tennessee River Valley, and then stretching all the way again into upstate New York. And that activity, again, slowly pushing toward the south and east into tonight, 10 p.m., then to the overnight hours, weakening in the eastern U.S., but still plenty of convection, potentially a line of storms here in central and eastern Oklahoma, and then reorganizing in West Texas, potentially overnight. The NAM can be a little bit too aggressive on these overnight storms, but nonetheless, certainly the potential for increased thunderstorm and precipitation development overnight. Then into tomorrow morning, this is now lunchtime Wednesday. See additional storms firing over Oklahoma, kind of sounding like a broken record at this point, over portions of North Texas into Missouri, and now Kansas. This is late in the day on Wednesday. And then that trough slowly moving off the continental divide here to the point where it was a get into Thursday. You can see what looks like more of a bona fide low pressure system now centered over Illinois, likely to reorganize storms here as you go through the day on Thursday. This is 10 a.m. and now stopping the forecast out at 1 a.m. You can almost see what's likely to be additional severe storm development kind of on a line out ahead of this low pressure system as we go through the day on Thursday. We'll have to take a look at that closer as we get closer to Thursday. But at least the day one outlook from the Storm Prediction Center has that enhanced risk all the way up into New York, stretching back through the Ohio River Valley. We talked about that activity here. A slight risk much more broadly all the way through Michigan, down through portions of southwest Texas. And this kind of second bullseye, we mentioned the stronger storms expected later today, and West Texas potentially forming on a line. So a wide area of risk here. And again, that front stretching across the country in North America is the focus for that. Day two, that activity shifts back further west. Again, same areas of Oklahoma and North Texas. We'll have to keep an eye on some flash flooding as a result of that. But severe activity potentially stretching up into the Ohio River Valley again. And then as that low pressure system kicks out on Thursday, that activity shifting a little bit off to the east here. So definitely a few areas to watch here over the coming days. Perhaps my greatest concern is the fact that Oklahoma and North Texas kept coming up in terms of just thunderstorm activity, let alone severe, and the flash flood threat is going to pick up later this week as a result of that. So you kind of this bullseye over Wichita Falls. Beyond that, an area of 1 inch plus of rainfall, likely shifting through the Ohio River Valley into the Midwest. I know there's a lot of field work happening just yesterday on Monday, but those rain chances are coming. We have that precipitation even moving through southern Illinois, central Illinois, and then central Indiana here today, and that renewed focus of precipitation here as we go through the day today on Tuesday. And then Wednesday to Thursday, seeing that precipitation coming out of the southern plains back up into the Midwest, potentially the Ohio River Valley and the Tennessee River Valley over the next kind of 4 to 5 days. We're going to jump over and look at the WPC, their excessive rainfall outlook. This is for Wednesday, but it continues on Thursday as well. And again, an area of concern here in Oklahoma, North Texas. I'd even stretch this back a little bit toward Wichita Falls for flash flooding. We'll have to keep an eye on this as we go through the next 72 hours. So take a step back and look at the jet stream. I talked just a minute ago about how we have the Pacific jet stream and the polar jet stream shifted off to the north. We've had this subtropical jet stream lingering for a while. It's actually kind of working with this trough here over the west to keep precipitation moving into the southern plains. But generally, that polar jet stream being shifted more to the north has me a little bit concerned as we get into May, early June. This is something I talked about last week as well. And if we're lacking some momentum coming through North America into the central U.S., generally, I think we should be able to see that if we kind of jump back and look over at the West Pacific. We're so often that kind of long-range or seasonal forecast. To start that discussion, I want to start here. This is believe me, a confusing plot here. This is what we call a Havmuller diagram. What we're looking at here is velocity potential, a term at the jet stream level of the atmosphere. We're actually looking at just the tropics, really kind of stretching back over the last 90 days. In fact, going back on this chart, or I should say going up on it, is going back in time. And it's really looking across the whole globe, being the west to the east here. Now, where I'm really kind of centered on here, there's a lot going on, is the West Pacific, which is actually all the way over here on this chart. And where we see these purple colors are where we see greater ascent or potentially thunderstorm development going back in time over the West Pacific. And that's in that purple. We're kind of using this as a proxy for telling us where a lot of the heat distribution, the thunderstorm activity, and the ascent in the atmosphere has been over the West Pacific. Now, at times in January and February, it was strong. Kind of early to start the year, we had this weakening period in between due to some MJO activity. And then it picked back up again in March. And the reason that I'm showing this and we look for this is this tends to keep things moving in the atmosphere. We tend to get more interesting weather, technically less of a risk for drought and persistent weather, because when we have plenty of momentum coming out of the West Pacific, we tend to have this kind of 3-4 days on, and then another storm system comes through, and then we go off, and then we have 3 more days on. And there's just a lot to talk about when we have a lot of momentum coming out of the West Pacific, influencing the Pacific jet stream at times. The MJO is moving. And we saw that at times this spring, especially if you kind of look at March, where we had a lot of this activity over the Western Pacific. Think about how many severe events we had, how much weather we had coming through North America and the Central US. We had the early March severe events, we had the mid-March severe events, and then certainly March 31st and then late April. But after that, it's kind of cut off a bit. We've noticed this lull in activity since then. We've had severe storms to talk about. They've shifted a little bit slower. They've shifted further west, or maybe the more proper tornado alley, and we haven't had nearly as many Midwest severe events coming all the way through the Ohio River Valley, and certainly not as many southeastern severe events, which we really started the year quickly in earlier this year. And so this can actually kind of tell us a lot about what's going on. Now, this is looking at the anomalies relative to average, and that's important here because if I just show you the absolute ascent in the atmosphere, I think it makes it more clear why we focus so much on the Western Pacific, because most of the tropical convection thunderstorm activity ascent in the atmosphere occurs over the West Pacific. Now, why does it occur over there? Well, put it simply, it's warm over what we call this kind of Indo-Pacific region, part of the Eastern Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific. This is the warmest sea surface temperatures on Earth. Compare that to the Eastern Pacific or the Western Pacific, which, right, if we've gone vacationing down here, certainly these waters are very warm and comfortable, and they're warmer later in the year in late summer, but just does not compare to how much fuel the thunderstorms have over here in the West Pacific. Portions of the Southeast Asian monsoon over in the Eastern Indian Ocean. So much of our weather story being downstream of that in North America starts over here, which is why we talk so much about the MJO, the Indian Ocean Dipole, all these other various acronyms and teleconnections show us where we're going to get momentum out of the West Pacific, how that might impact the jet stream going forward. Now, right now, if we look at the sea surface temperatures valid as of just a few days ago here in late April, we're actually relatively warm here. We're cold off the west coast of North America, cold near Cabo, and then stretching down into that weakening La Nina here along the equator. But why we've seen a relative lull in April coming out of the West Pacific, I don't have a straight answer for you. When we do see that lack of momentum, though, we get concerned about signatures like this over in the Eastern Pacific, which might influence some troughing here in the jet stream, which would influence ridging over the Central U.S., potentially prompting heat or drought concerns over the Central U.S. So when we see weakening momentum coming out of the West Pacific, we're looking at other influences further closer, I should say, to North America, which is why we can focus on that. Now, again, if we jump over and look at those absolute anomalies, we can actually still see, or I shouldn't say anomalies, just the absolute values. We can still see these areas of weakness in that momentum, one being here during February, and then as we went into April here as well. There's certainly still ascent in the West Pacific. Those waters are still warm, but ever so slightly less activity here. And that starts to prompt that concern going into May. If this continues, right, stretching down into the future, the forecast is not on this map. Stretching down into the future, we'd see less of that momentum in the atmosphere. And it really starts over here. This is the West Pacific again, how this influences the jet stream, how much momentum is coming out of the West Pacific. Because as it comes over here near North America, we need to know, is it likely to dive into a trough here in summer, produce ridging over North America? The exact nature of that is going to determine what kind of growing season that we have. Now, 2012, we saw a lack of momentum out of the West Pacific, despite it being relatively neutral in terms of those temperatures, colder in some areas, warmer in others. But as that flow came up and over North America, under the influence of all this cold water here, Over the eastern Pacific, we saw a ridge here over the warm water in the central Pacific, a trough here across the eastern Pacific, a trough here, perhaps due to some of this cold water here over the western Atlantic, a ridge over the central part of the country, and we lacked rainfall for a significant amount of the growing season. The good news is we don't see that exact map here today in 2025. Relatively warm in the West Pacific. We do see a little bit of that cold kind of horseshoe signature, at least half of that horseshoe over across the west coast of, I should say just off the west coast of North America. But it's certainly far away from where we were in 2012 at this exact same time in late April. So there are some concerns here. They're not as glaring as they were, but there is this general lack of momentum. And if we just look at the last 7 days of observed precip, you can see that kind of splotchy nature to some of the thunderstorm development here, kind of indicating to us that that flow is still up here. It's almost over Canada, the northern plains, the upper Midwest, into New England. And underneath it, while we have rain, which is good, we still need that rain, right? It's showing up as a lack of flow here. I think this is best indicated just in the forecast going into early May. So we're going to walk through the 500 millibar height forecast, get a sense of where we're going with the trough and ridge pattern. Let's make it valid here. So this morning, 7 a.m., Tuesday, April 29th, there's that weak trough here, which again is looking more cut off. So this flow here between the ridges and the troughs here still very much shifted to the north. We have this cut off low here across the west coast. Over the next few days, that's going to be moving off into the central part of the country, prompting that shift in the severe thunderstorm activity and the precipitation. This is on Thursday. We walked through that just a second ago. As we get into Friday, see some weak troughing moving here behind that cutoff low as it moved through portions of the central and eastern U.S. But then we have another potential cutoff low here across California. This is on Sunday morning, bringing temperatures down in California, likely organizing precipitation here across the high southern plains. So take this through Sunday, Monday, and now very early Tuesday. See, again, this weak trough just kind of parked here across the Four Corners area, likely bringing quite a bit of activity here to portions of the southern plains again. Now, the ECMWF has been cutting off this low here as it makes its way east. It kind of leaves this behind, and this could organize some precipitation here over the Carolinas, potentially the southeast, bring some cooler temperatures next week. The GFS has not had this in its forecast for a while, but the GFS isn't performing fantastically right now, so I tend to lean toward the ECMWF. But while these two cutoff lows kind of mingle here across the southern U.S., all the while we're still seeing that general lack of momentum from the jet stream here, with this much more dominant ridging now unfolding to the north of that over the upper Midwest, portions of Canada, portions of the northern plains here as we get out into the work week next week. So we'll have activity here in the southern plains. We'll have activity in the Carolinas. We're going to be warming up and drying out on an area in between these two going through next week. Now, if I jump over and show you the precipitation from that same forecast going forward, we'll get an idea of what this is doing in terms of where those thunderstorms will be developing. Take this forecast through Wednesday afternoon. We talked about that activity shifting more over portions of Oklahoma and North Texas, the flooding threat associated with that. As we go through the day Thursday, that activity is shifting off to the east a bit over Illinois, Indiana, now through the Ohio River Valley, the middle Mississippi River Valley. This is Thursday around lunchtime. That weak low pressure system that we talked about associated with that. Shifting off to the east on Friday, that front lingering back behind it. This is Friday evening. Activity continuing to stretch through the kind of mid-Atlantic up into New England on Saturday, with that front stretching down along the Gulf Coast, all the way through West Texas. And then by Sunday, you'd see the activity of that trough now coming onshore in the western U.S., making its presence felt, even likely to get some snow up in the Sierra Nevadas. We're all the way out here into early May. Impressive to see some of the snowfall here in that forecast due to that cutoff low moving into the western U.S., focusing that severe thunderstorm development potentially next week, early next week in the plains, southern plains, maybe even up into the central plains. Tuesday and Wednesday, see more of that activity here. The influence of that cutoff low bringing precipitation now all the way out to Thursday of next week. So we're getting well out into the forecast here. But what we haven't seen is a lot of activity in here. So going drier in portions of the Midwest, potentially over in the western Corn Belt and the eastern Corn Belt at times as well. Now the GFS, I'll take this forecast out quickly to next week. We're seeing that same cutoff low over the Four Corners. This is Tuesday, right? Organizing that thunderstorm development likely early next week, but we don't see that cutoff low. Right? It didn't develop that same cutoff low over the eastern U.S. and not seeing that same level of activity from the GFS, from their precipitation. If I just take their precipitation forecast out to Tuesday of next week, we see that activity over the plains, but we don't see that same activity over the Carolinas. I lean toward this forecast from the ECMWF because it's been performing much better here in late April, likely early May as well, So some shower activity and chances early next week I think would be likely for portions of the southeast and the Carolinas, but on the sub-severe level here. If we jump over and look at the total precip from the ECMWF, I'll take this out to Friday and then Saturday, so we can see that elevated precipitation amounts here over Oklahoma. Again, that Wichita Falls bullseye that I've kept mentioning up through northeastern Oklahoma, a wide area of 1 inch plus of rainfall here across the Midwest into the Central Plains here as we go through the work week this week. But I'm going to take this forecast out further. Monday, now Tuesday of next week, there's that snowfall we talked about, potentially some showers and precipitations along the coast of California. Light amounts, but in late April and early May, not as common here to get this much precipitation across the western U.S. Certainly not seeing as much snowfall later in the year like we're seeing in the forecast here. But as we go into Wednesday and Thursday, we haven't been increasing the rain amounts here. Where we have been increasing the rain amounts is over in the southern plains, even the southern high plains. Look how far back we're getting some of this precipitation values up toward 2, 3, 4 inches of rainfall in some of these areas. And if I even pick on some of these bullseyes here near Guthrie, Texas, over toward Wichita Falls, we're getting up into the 5, 6, 7, 8 range here. So an area of flash flooding concern is definitely increasing here over portions of the southern plains as we go into the next work week. Now, this forecast is way out there. The exact nature of this, it's not like we can point out any one of these bullseyes and say it's going to happen exactly here, but there's a wide area of risk here I'll have to keep an eye on next week. Because of that cutoff low forecast from the ECMWF, look at how different the forecast is from the Euro versus the GFS with some higher precipitation amounts in portions of eastern Virginia here over toward the Carolinas as well. That's something we'll have to watch as well. If I jump over and show you just the GFS forecast, it looks a bit different here. We'll jump over and look at the ECMWF, the 10-day precipitation anomaly. There's those bullseyes we were talking about, eastern Virginia, certainly the southern plains, drier in between. Remember, this precipitation here is coming through this week. So really, if I were able to take this forecast out, 4 to 10 days, we'd see a much drier swath here over the Midwest, but it's kind of bracketing that as higher precipitation values. The GFS, comparatively for eastern Virginia over that 10-day forecast, is technically on the drier side for eastern Virginia. So a pretty clear split. Now, the GFS is also pulling some of that stronger rain a little bit further east in Oklahoma, southeast Kansas, western Missouri. Certainly still bringing rain to west Texas and central Texas, but just shifting that highest amounts a bit to the east. Again, I'm leaning toward this ECMWF solution with this highest concern a little bit further west over Texas and western Oklahoma. As a result of that, the Climate Prediction Center from May 6th through the 12th has put an area of moderate risk for excessive rainfall here, anywhere from southern Kansas, stretching through much of Texas, much of Oklahoma as well. Again, this area we'll have to watch closely because they've had so much rain recently. There's so much in the forecast now, we're really increasing those flooding concerns. Now, again, I'm not usually showing an early May snowfall forecast from the ECMWF, but nonetheless, over the Intermountain West, the Front Range of the Colorado Rockies, looking at potentially a foot of snowfall as this next trough comes in over the weekend into early next week, and potentially a foot in the southern Sierra Nevadas as well, which is impressive this late in the year. I want to jump over and show you the ECMWF ensemble. This is the probability of accumulating more than 4 inches of rainfall, just total through the forecast here. I'm going to take this forecast out through this week. This takes us through Saturday, and it highlights that area of concern here. Again, Wichita Falls through central Oklahoma, through southwest Missouri. Now, this exact kind of swath here, it's not just this area, right? I'm going to draw a little bit bigger of an area. We saw that moderate risk. It was even into portions of western Arkansas, but at least this run of the ECMWF ensemble, pinning that swath more so in here across central Oklahoma. That's just this week. I'm going to take this through the weekend, and then early next week, Wednesday through Thursday, see a broader area of concern here. If I just draw the 30% contour of getting greater than 4 inches, pretty wide swath here with a decent chance for pretty heavy rainfall and flooding threat as we go through the work week next week. And again, that bullseye in that kind of Wichita Falls area keeps showing up time and time and again. So if you're in this area here, southern or southwest Oklahoma, North Texas, the concern is growing for flash flooding over the next 6 days. I haven't talked much in temperature about this video. Let's see how much time I have left. We'll have some time here to talk about where we're going with temperatures. So this is, we're looking at the maximum temperature forecast. I'm going to take this quickly because we're seeing largely moderate temperatures over the next few days, just as underneath some of this precipitation, generally on the warm side, but folks underneath some of the clouds and precip and the forecast seeing generally cooler temperatures. But where we really start to see some dichotomy across the country is really getting into this weekend. So Sunday, May 4th, seeing temperatures warm up here. Talked about a potential dry stretch beginning for portions of the Midwest. We're seeing that reflected, I think, in the forecast here. Much cooler temperatures in the western U.S. here this weekend under the influence of that trough. So take this forecast out into Monday of next week. You can see almost that split across the country, where high 70s, low 80s. East of the Continental Divide, much cooler than that to the west. Minimum temperatures, take this forecast in through Wednesday. Thursday, cooler in New England on Thursday morning. Warmer across much of the country. Like I said, moderate for most areas through this week. Behind the front on Saturday, a little bit cooler overnight, but not really seeing major frost or freeze concerns get into some of the kind of recently planted areas here over the Midwest. Temperatures getting down into the low 40s. And that stretches through the Ohio River Valley Sunday morning. But again, the influence of that trough now being felt over the western U.S. with those cooler temperatures. Right now, it's a little bit too early to say confidently, but right now, not seeing any major kind of frost or freeze risk in some of these intensive agricultural valleys, even some of the upland areas here in Western California. That's right now, fairly confident in that, but don't want to rule out some frost advisories, which could come into the forecast later Sunday, Monday, or Tuesday morning. Now, as we get down to the next work week, the 5 to 10 day temperature anomalies, you can see the influence of that ridge now building over the Midwest and southern Canada, right? We talked about the potential next week for ridge development. I'll take the ECMWF AIFS forecast out into Wednesday, May 7th. There's that cutoff flow number 1. There's that Virginia cutoff flow. Curious to see it also in the AIFS, which runs on a totally different background than just the proper ECMWF, also has that cutoff flow, right? Prompting those heavier precipitation concerns in North Carolina and Virginia. Also has this cutoff flow over the southern plains, but look at this broad ridging now developing anywhere from Newfoundland all the way over to California here. And it's the influence of this and the dominance of this that has me a little bit concerned as we go through May, because if I take this forecast out into the future, you can see it's still positioned here all the way out into next week. And we do have this cutoff flow that's kind of parked here, but this is a very blocked-like signature where we have a ridge over a trough here, and these don't like to move when they develop. Now, we're well out into the forecast here, well into next weekend, so can't put too much faith into this, but generally this kind of lack of momentum is still showing up in the long range going out into May. And what that can do is it can keep ridging over one area for a long time, but there's kind of a yin and yang to this. It can keep these cutoff flows parked over the same area for quite a while as well. So kind of curiously, it's not a coincidence that we're concerned about a lack of momentum and we're talking about too much rainfall over the southern plains. We just have too many cutoff flows kind of parked and moving slowly over the same area, ridging to the north of that. And that's kind of the yin and yang to this, where we have areas that are getting too much rainfall, too much cooler weather, too many clouds, and areas that are getting too much heat, too much warmth, and too dry. Early in the year, when we needed some of the precipitation on here, it's not the worst, but it becomes a significant concern, right, when flooding starts to creep into the forecast. And while it's decent planting weather for some areas and more of these northern acres here, if it persists into June and July, that conversation shifts pretty quickly. The 8 to 14 day outlook from the Climate Prediction Center shows the influence of that ridge, where we have warmer weather very likely over the Midwest and in the upper Midwest more specifically, cooler weather under the influence of these cutoff lows further to the south, where naturally we're expecting more precipitation as well. If I jump over and show you that signature, drier across portions of the Midwest, Ohio River Valley, potentially some precipitation here getting into the northern plains, but largely that focus more so on the southern plains, perhaps the southeast. If I look at the long-term forecast from the ECMWF extended, right, that concern where we have momentum to the north, but a lack of it to the south keeps showing up in the late, I should even say middle to late May forecast. This is May 10th through June 10th. The extended ECMWF precipitation anomalies, which show momentum, precipitation in the upper Midwest, southern Canada, but a lack of it further to the south. Now, right now, that's manifesting as these cutoff flows are coming through, and that's bringing precipitation, almost too much precipitation, to some areas now. But as we get further into the growing season, more into summer, those become less reliable features that we can count on later in the year. What's more likely to develop with a lack of momentum if it lingers, and there are open questions to that. We just showed how different we are this year, at least in those Pacific sea surface temperatures to 2012. But there's enough concern now with this lack of momentum if it persists into late May and early June of an extended dry stretch across the central part of the country. We'll get to that when we get to that. We're looking well out into the forecast here, just some things to be concerned with. I mentioned those Pacific sea surface temperatures. The same forecast from the ECMWF extended model here does have 500 millibar height anomalies. I'm actually going to take that forecast into May for a second here. And we talked so much about 2012, right? We always like to bring that one up as kind of an extreme analog. And I talked about this cold weather here across the Northeast Pacific and off the coast of the West Coast of America. Now we have this signature here now. We just looked at that, right? But we don't see that troughing here, or I should say the cool waters here upwelled into the Gulf of Alaska here, that is south of Alaska, west of Canada. Now, this water here is moderated by the atmosphere. So what the atmosphere is doing in the Gulf of Alaska can change the sea surface temperature profile here, and vice versa, right? It's kind of this, what came first, the chicken or the egg to it. So take this ECMWF extended forecast into mid-May. What kind of concerns me here, May 16th through May 23rd, is this troughing here that's developing here off of the Northeast Pacific, south of Alaska, west of Canada. This troughing would likely develop low pressure systems, potentially relatively strong ones for late April. Excuse me, I should say mid-May. And these troughs tend to bring wind, rain, precipitation, all things that help to upwell water and bring cooler water into this area here. So if this forecast from the ECMWF weeklies comes to fruition, right, we could be cooling off these waters here in May going into the growing season, and that's just never a recipe. I like to be talking about going into June and then July, cooling waters in the Northeast Pacific. Now, this is May 16th through May 23rd. It is currently April 29th. That is a 15 to 30 day forecast. Our skill scores on these, even in the Northeast Pacific, are not too reliable, but just as one signal, it is a concern. We'll have to keep an eye on the activity here and look at how these sea surface temperatures change in the Northeast Pacific over the next 30 days to get an idea of how much of this drought risk that we're concerned about now will persist into early June. We'll take a look at that as we get to it. Thanks for watching here today. Eric will talk with you all tomorrow.